For far too long, I struggled with two things. We'll get the first one out of the way real quick. The first one is we were colonized by the British. I have an accent. You noticed it. It's difficult sometimes to hear my words, but I'll try my best. And the second one is, as a theologian, I wanted to fit in places and spaces that were not fit for me. And so today I'm going to take you on a journey on how I discovered my call to authenticity. It started on a Friday. I was sitting at home watching Anderson Cooper 360. It was a boring day. And because I didn't have anything else to do, I decided to go to the digital realm of social media. I didn't go to Facebook or Instagram. I went to Grindr. For those unfamiliar with Grindr, and for those who are watching, Grindr is a gay man's hookup app where you quickly realize if you're compatible with one another by asking a series of questions which I will censor, and then decide if you're going to meet. And so we were going back and forth with this wonderful gentleman called George. And we were going back and forth trying to figure out if we were compatible. And it turned out we were. And so I invited him to meet me at a Thai restaurant. To that extent, I'm better. There are some people who, I'm not better, I'm different. There are people who go past the meeting stage. So I didn't. I tried to do the meeting stage first. And so we were sitting at a Thai restaurant, eating some meal, looking at each other. But first, let me tell you about George. When George arrived, he was wearing these beautiful, beautiful daddy hoochie shorts, right? He was also wearing a very silk velvet t-shirt, the kind that tells you that he used to go to the gym, right? Unlike me, right? You could tell he had the perfect body. In fact, I'll go on a limb here and tell you he looked like the Duke of Hastings in Bridgerton. And so as we talked and hung out, part of me was trying to find as a sport. Again, when it comes to Grindr, usually you're hosting or you're traveling. So I was not doing the hosting, George was not doing the hosting, so we were traveling. Give me know what that means. And so we're trying to drive to find a beautiful spot in San Francisco where we're going to get intimate and do the things that we needed to do and get that out of the way. And as we stopped in that beautiful place and we were carelessly caressing each other, kissing, loving on each other, I heard a familiar voice. A voice that I've heard so many times in my life. I call it the voice of God. Other people call it the voice of higher consciousness, the ancestors, the voice of doing greater good. Whatever you call it, I'll call it for this story the voice of God. I've heard that story many times. I've heard that voice many times before that. As a pastor, as a charismatic pastor, I'll preach in church and tell people, this is what I hear God say. And so that voice was familiar when I heard it. But it came at the wrong time. At the wrong place, the wrong location, with the wrong person. And so the voice told me, ask him what shoe he's wearing. I said, why would I need to ask him that? And I continued with the kissing and the caressing and the voice got stronger. Ask him why he wore those specific shoes. And so I looked at George and I told George, hey, I'm so sorry. But why did you wear those shoes today? His shirt is unbuttoned. He's wearing daddy hoochie shorts. It's very easy to get your way around it. And he's wondering, why are we caring about the shoes? That's not where our focus should be. And I told him, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm a pastor. Bad place to introduce yourself as a pastor. And he said, oh my God, I'm a worship leader. I said, perfect timing. I say, God is telling me. Of course, now I didn't have to hide. I was like, God is telling me to ask you something about your shoe. And I want to know, what is it about your shoe? And George looked at me, paused a minute, and then said, I wanted to kill myself. And this was the last meeting before I committed suicide. It's a bad thing to be in that place when you're horny and somebody wants to kill themselves after the fact. And so I realized that I couldn't be the Grindr date. I had to be the spiritual guide at that point. See, all my life, I've wanted to be a minister. When I was 10, I went to my priest at the Catholic Church. His name was Father Dominic. And I told Father Dominic, I want to become a priest. And Father Dominic looked at me and said, you can't date Catherine. That was my girlfriend then. And I said, why? He said, well, if you're going to be a priest, you can't marry. And I knew then that wasn't my call. That was easy. And then I decided to pursue the same call, but in a Pentecostal church. I was preaching, I was speaking in tongues, I was a pastor of a 10,000 church. And then I decided to follow God's call to Atlanta in a Bible school, where I was doing my degree in theology. And as I was seated there, my professor, who was a mentor to me, in one of the classes was talking everything bad about LGBTQ, about homosexuals, as my professor liked to call them. And my professor was going on and on about those people. There can be no God in them. Very contradictory. And instead of me answering to that call that the pastor was calling me to, I decided, and God agreed with me, that I could no longer be in that seminary. And so I quit school, moved out of Atlanta, and decided that issues of God were no longer things for me to pursue. Years later, my good friend who we used to pastor with in a church in Kenya, his name is Pastor Peter, was here in California. I was hosting him. And we were sitting with him, talking, having fun. And of course, he brings that idea that God hates homosexuals. And he brings all the scriptures. And I knew these scriptures by heart. I was a pastor. I've lived the scriptures. At that point, I was angry. I was so angry because I was tired of people using the Bible against my sexuality, against who I was. And so we went back and forth. But this time I had a degree too. And so I was really doing things to make him look really bad in the moment of everyone there. And it felt so good doing this to this guy. It felt so good. Until that voice came again and told me, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And in my defense, I said, it is your people that are ignorant. I can't help it. Look at your people, how ignorant they are. And the voice said, have I ever done something to make you feel unloved or hated? And I realized at that moment that no, the Spirit had never done this. And it was through that, and now George, coming back to the story of George and I with my granddad date, right? It was through that evening with George, when he also told me that he wanted to take his life, that I could respond to this call of being authentic, that I could wear my authentic spiritual guide hat right after wearing my grinder hookup dating app. It was in that moment that I realized that it was okay to serve God as a minister and as LGBTQ. It was at that moment that I realized that God does not ask me to change who I was, but rather wanted to sit with me to hear my story and love me for that story. And so to come to God for me wasn't to leave any part behind, but rather bring all those parts to the Spirit, so that the Spirit can use them for the Spirit good. And I see that in everything I do. I see it when I'm talking to Pastor Peter, who my heart doesn't want to love, but God tells me to love him anyway. And I see it in my grinder hookup with George, who I want to do all kinds of things that I will censor myself from saying here, and God telling me, this is where you become a spiritual guide. And more importantly, I see it in the work I do at MLIFE Foundation, where we help children, youth, and adults to see God as they should see it. And so my call, or my answer to this question of how do we discover our call and our authenticity, the way I responded to this is knowing that God does not look perfection from me, but rather he wants to work with me through my imperfections. He doesn't look for conformity. He wants to work with me even when I stand out. And more importantly, I don't need to be whole to be used. I need to be used because I'm a variable. Thank you so much.